how do we hold those both? That we need some individual coherence and strength in us. And then on the spiritual path, at some point, we also let that go.
So let's see, we covered self-compassion, because I think all of these are aspects I was wanting to tease out too from how we explore the all, which was that original question. What's the role of sort of a creative stance or an exploratory stance? And are there ways we can cultivate that?
As I mentioned before, the all is so much bigger than any one of us could possibly comprehend in its entirety. Otherwise, we would be the all, right? We would be the divine one if we totally knew and understood everything. So I think we're working our way toward a deep level of understanding that's still from our vantage point as an individual human. And creativity comes into that because if we're stuck or locked in patterns, but we're willing to experiment with them, we can then access a different part of reality or life or our connection with the all. It can be very simple, just like if you've stayed in one religious tradition, it might be great for you to stay there because we want a deep well. And if we cultivate that deep well, that can bring us, or some people talk about the mountain, there are many paths up the mountain, whatever metaphor you like to use, great. All I'm saying is that depth and persistence is really good. And most of the spiritual masters teach us that it's super important to stick with a path as long as it is working and feeling like you're making progress. And sometimes you don't feel like you're making progress. It's not working and you want to jump the boat. But that's sometimes because it's part of the path, actually, to be stymied. So that set aside, I think where creativity can come in is not jumping tracks completely, unless that is what we are called to do by Spirit, by the Holy One. But in small ways, subtle ways, we can shift something about our practice or what we do and see what the effect is. Maybe 2 decades ago, I noticed that I had a really strong negative thinking pattern. If a series of bad things would happen to start my day, I would get that rumination going, like, this is a horrible day and I'm unlucky, and I would get sour and my negativity bias would start looking throughout my day for everything else that was going wrong. And I experimented with a simple practice that was like, anytime something would go wrong, I was going to try saying, I'm so glad that happened because, and see what my brain filled in. Because in addition to the negativity bias in our brain, that is part of our biology meant to help us survive as human animals in the wild, like looking for threats and danger and making sure we attune to anything negative so we don't get eaten alive. We also have a meaning-making part of our brain, and the meaning-making part of our brain is always trying to figure things out and make meaning. Even scientific research has shown out of nothing, like random things, we will find meaning in. So I knew that I could tap into this meaning-making part of my brain. So when I woke up and I stubbed my toe on the oven, instead of being like, oh, my day is starting like crap, I said, oh, I'm so glad this happened because, and I let the meaning-making part of my brain jump in. And it was like, because if you hadn't sat down to rest your toe, then you would have gone outside and tripped over a log and broke your arm, whatever. So I would let my meaning-making brain invent reasons why my suffering, what I was attached to as suffering anyway, would actually be better for me. And with that simple practice, I started to let go of some of the attachment I had on poor me, pitying myself if something goes wrong. And then slowly through that experimentation of just saying, oh, I'm so glad this happened. I'm so glad I got stuck in traffic today and I'm half an hour late for my meeting because now, what good could come out of this? Eventually that practice helped me calm that negativity bias and the reaction I had to it and just see things as like, oh, this happened. Okay, this has happened. Bring a more present state of mind. And so that's like an example of how experimentation can work. Like, does this help me shift from where I am to where I want to go? I was really getting stuck and drained, and then I was able to become more accepting and present. And I just want to make a caveat. I know I'm going on about this for a bit, but I want to make a caveat that I'm not telling people to find a silver lining in every cloud. I'm not somebody who believes everything happens for a reason. I don't think there is extreme oppression and other really unfortunate abusive things in the world because something good is going to come out of it. I'm not in that scheme of things. I believe that we can learn from things if we want to, but I don't think that's the purpose of them. I don't think that's meant to be. So just a caveat on that.
That's a really important caveat. I'm with you there. Because you're right that sometimes that is the way then that it starts to go. And then try to include that as well. And I don't think it needs to. It can be its own way that we're exploring with ourselves. That's not that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm talking about more like I was working with my own negativity lens versus the ways that I've worked with my previous trauma are different than that. I'm not saying, oh, I'm so glad that trauma happened to me, and now I'm going to do this. I think when I work with people who have experienced horrific things or even just self-degradation, it's a much deeper, more complex. I just gave you the example of the first thing that popped into my mind when you said experiment, be creative. So,
well, that's quite an amazing one with the transformation. And I guess sometimes we probably do ones and then they won't be necessarily something that takes, but that's okay. So,
we might, a lot of people who meditate who pick a word or a mantra to focus on. Many traditions suggest sticking with that one for a long time. And for some reasons, we might change or experiment with something else, and we'll find out what happens. And maybe we go back to the original one, or we don't know. But the purpose is that awareness, that noticing again, and how we eventually want that awareness to sink into something beyond awareness of ourselves. We eventually also want the noticing to fall back, to drop away, and to become isness, to become being, to become harmony and flow.
Yeah.
Between ourselves and everything that we're interconnected with.
Yeah. I'm going to do a slight jump here just in the interest of time, although flow makes me think of it a little bit, which is, you were talking about how we aren't the all. But then there's these sort of interesting experiences sometimes we have, or states, I guess, that are unitive, let's say. So we sort of sometimes have this conceptualization of where we can experience unitive states, or maybe we even just think about how we're the web of all being, or however we're conceptualizing that or experiencing it. I'm curious, because this is a lot of what I think about a lot too, and do a lot of my work on, is sort of that particular and the particularity, because obviously the wholeness is so important that we're really including all and welcoming all, and that's very much in a way about identity too, something like identity. On the other hand, there's sort of the shedding of identity, and so this feels like this sort of paradox, right? Seemingly, I don't think it really is. Like when I feel into it, it isn't. But it seems like a paradox between kind of welcoming everything and identity and coming to wholeness and integration, and shedding identity and experiencing unitive states. So I would love to hear your take on that, and just any like experiences or thoughts. It's a big topic that, it's not necessarily pin downable, I don't think, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
It is super complex, and I don't have clarity of answers. I'm halfway through life. Who knows really how long I'll live? Could be tomorrow, but in my 40s, I'm thinking I've had different experiences of the all, of unity with oneness from my vantage point. I'm sure there's much more, and I'm not sure what that ultimately might look like and be like. So one of the folks I really respect who talks about different unitive states is Genjo Marinello. He gave a workshop through Spiritual Directors International and talked about how different unitive states kind of come about, and what happens in them. As you mentioned, like through nature, we can find ourselves being at one with nature, where the division between my lips and the tree's bark suddenly doesn't exist, because the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between us feels so true, so real, that we see that me and the tree are one being, right? And in that unitive state, it's like my identity as Shannon suddenly expands and becomes Shannon in the tree, right? Or Shannon in the forest, or Shannon in the world, however big you want to go. And so maybe I still have my identity, but am experiencing me as a greater one than I have ever experienced before. There's other unitive states where I feel like my identity is erased, right? Where like all of a sudden there is no Shannon, or there is no tree, there is nothingness. That all these forms, right, are changing. And that's what's so fun about the body. When we look at impermanence, we start to see how nothing is real. Nothing is really here. I have some water, and water is kind of real, but then I drink it and it becomes liquid blood in me, and then I pee and it becomes urine, and all of a sudden I'm like, well, was this the same element or not? What is it? When is it now no longer water, or no longer pee, or that all this is just so temporary in the history. And so we can come to more of a place of nothingness. Like there is no me, really. I'm just like a blip of molecules that got assembled in this way. And I have these this microbiome in my gut that has more parts that are not me than me. All these little organisms living inside me, digesting things, right? So we can, when we're through kind of that physical reality of constant change, we can just have no identity, or feel like there's nothing. And I think where the paradox comes in, or at least the crux of my question, is which methods or routes we're taking to get to those unitive states. Because in some spiritual and religious traditions, there are practices of self-denial, or practices of dropping that strong ego identity. And as I mentioned, trauma before and psychological states, we know that it is true for most of us. Most of the world now, even before COVID, has experienced post-traumatic stress from at least one stressful event in their life. More people have than have not. And the repair work that we need to be healthy, whole human beings includes reintegrating a sense of wholeness in our identity. And so in the spiritual realm, how do we say we want to drop this identity and let go of the ego to join in a surrendering fashion, the mind of Christ, or the will of Allah, or whatever words and concepts we're using to get toward that oneness? How could we practice letting go and dissolving into that, when so many of us actually don't have a coherent sense of self and a bottom line knowing of our true individuality, to let that go into a true nature that's beyond us? That's the paradox that I see over and over, is how do we encourage these practices that also on a cultural level are saying, let's not be selfish, let's not be greedy, let's not be individualistic, let's not say me, my, mine, right? Let's get back to a culture of giving, of sharing, of seeing that we all belong, because we all need to be one. How do we hold those both? That we need some individual coherence and strength in us, and then on the spiritual path, at some point, we also let that go. Yeah. And so whether that's in temporary moments, we temporarily let it go and we come back to it, or whether we seek that always, we seek to be an enlightened being who is somehow unified at all points in our life. That's the question I'm holding, Sonja.
It is. And I think maybe the only thing we can say is to be with what is. So, kind of in the same way, sometimes you are dropped into a unitive state. if what's before you is integration, which a lot of the time it is, and most of the time it is probably, that's what's before you too. I mean, but yes, it is. It's not really. I think it's not either or, and that's what our minds are just trying to make it be. But yes, thank you for elucidating all that, though, because that was a really, really helpful to think about, I think, in terms of like everyone's healing journey and what they need.
Briefly, I'll share, as I mentioned, that I work with people one-on-one, a lot of times with adults who have had childhood trauma or are trying to reach a different way of experiencing themselves in the world and are on a spiritual path in some way, like see who they are as humans, having meaningfulness and figuring out what that is. And so many people meet with me in my office where we are now, but I also meet outside in nature with folks. And when I meet with people virtually, if people want to work with me via Zoom, we can also be on laptops or cell phones, so that we can involve nature in our healing process. If that is particularly potent or something new for you that you haven't worked on or experienced, as we've said, the body is so important and our body's relationship with nature is so important. So from time to time, I offer workshops that are in person and also online. And you can find out about them on my website, Divine Nature Therapy. But the best thing to do is to sign up for my once a month newsletter, because that's really where I list out details about my offerings, and then also have reflections like the one we had today, kind of pondering how all these experiences of being human fit together.
That's wonderful. Yes, I definitely encourage everyone to get onto her newsletter. Thank you so much, Shannon, for joining us today.
You're welcome. I will leave you with a quote by Joan of Arc, and my response to Joan. She's a saint and said, "How else could God reach me but through my imagination?" And I say, yes, Joan, exactly. And God can also reach us through our bodies.